Good evening. I'm Chris, and as you may or may not know, I edited David Rickerby's Northern Nights trilogy. Right here. In chapter 1 of part 2 of the second novel, Aarhus Games, Aarhus Rules, we meet Dr. Gray. A couple of years ago, I reworked those 6 pages into a play of sorts. I was going to film it partly as a promotional thing for Dave's work, partly to keep me out of the bus for 5 minutes. But in the end, Dave decided to go in another direction. I forgot all about it, so now I'm kind of thinking of going into audiobook recording. Certainly do a few. I thought it might be fun to give it a read here. Certainly use the practice and its content that could help Dave sell a few more books. And who knows, maybe someone will hear it and want this flat dirge of a voice reading out their work. It's either that or be back down the dock doing favours for sailors. This will probably be one take, unless I mess it up completely. I am relatively inexperienced, so please be gentle. And you don't have to sit glued to the screen. There won't be any costume changes or anything. Your ears are all I need. And yes, I am having a drink for my stage fright. Right. Aarhus Games, Aarhus Rules by David Rickerby. Part 2, Chapter 1. From out the corner of his eye, Dr. Gray caught the glint of the blade reflected by candlelight, followed by a low groan from Mr. Vestervang. He was alive. Tragically, such was Dr. Gray's haste to lend aid that he slipped in the unfortunate gore, throwing out his arms to save himself. And what a cruel irony that instinct was, for this aligned hand with knife then came all his weight behind as he had buried to the haft in Mr. Vestervang's chest, an act which caused the poor man to finally gasp his last. Understandably appalled, Dr. Gray leapt to his feet, rationalizing that so severe was his guest's initial trauma that nothing could have been done to save him in any case. His greatest aggrievement was that his clumsiness had left the darkened study in complete disarray, its contents nearly as blood-stained as he, and with any evidentiary value to the events which the scene may have possessed, destroyed utterly, except no doubt his fingerprints on the knife itself. Any accidental witness to this bloody presentation, wholly ignorant of the preceding calamity, would doubtless conclude, understandably but quite erroneously, that it was he who had delivered the fatal blow to Mr. Vestervang. He had to confess, the thought of not contacting the authorities was an attractive one. After all, no one would know that he'd been expecting anyone that evening. The meeting had been arranged verbally with repeated assurances from his guest that it was understood, due to its highly confidential nature. How discretion was paramount. Mr. Vestervang was of slight stature but quite some bulk, so it would be no small feat to transport his body the 100 metres or so to the woods at the bottom of the garden. Fortunately, an absence of neighbours meant Dr. Gray could do this without being observed. But should he? This was not his doing. He was an innocent man. And yet there would be questions, one of which would be, "On what grounds was Mr. Vestervang a ghost in your home this evening, Doctor?" The men were not known to be friends. In fact, after a small disagreement over a business matter, a slight difference of opinion over accounting methods, some believe they were even enemies. Absolute nonsense, of course, as if one could ever take umbrage with a gentleman of Mr. Vestervang's calibre. Dr. Gray blamed himself. If only he'd just ignored that noise from upstairs, then the fool wouldn't have insisted on accompanying him to investigate. If only they'd see that you're just hearing things. The house was a large Victorian property which had been in Dr. Gray's family for generations. As an only child adopted on his mother's remarriage, he'd inherited it following the premature death of his parents some years prior. His father's affection for classic automobiles had been eclipsed by his ineptitude at maintaining them. The same could also be said of his parenting skills, an area where, much as any other, little could be said of his mother. Aside from several landholdings, the house and grounds were the only remaining asset after decades of fiscal imprudence on the part of his dissolute kin. recent generations having resolved to live off the work of their forebears with no concern for their legacy. Dr. Gray found himself grinning as he had earlier at the incongruous sight of Mr. Vestervang standing outside his study with that Damascene blade held awkwardly in his thick little fingers. His guest had taken this reaction, as with everything he considered, and rightly so in this case, to be merriment at his expense. I've forgotten the voice I did now. I fail to see what's so amusing, a painfully redundant observation, about leaving dangerous weapons laying around. Nonsense, said Dr. Gray, walking down the hallway and holding out his hand. I assure you it's quite harmless. Frowning, Mr. Vestervang handed over the knife, doing so, surprisingly, in the correct fashion, haft first, the point towards himself. As if he hadn't looked ridiculous enough wielding the blade, his look of stupefaction as Dr. Gray thrust it into his own chest was a sight to behold. After a pause, Dr. Gray began to laugh with an intensity bordering on the hysterical. In fact, he laughed so much he dropped the knife, and it was a few minutes before he was capable of coherent speech. Here Mr. Vestervang provided great assistance, as his slack-jawed look of horror turned to one of annoyed offence. "It's just a fake knife," he declared. "Not quite." "Oh, it's completely real," said Dr. Gray, "although it does have a secret, because while I may have my talents, imperviousness to penetrating trauma isn't one of them. Please allow me to demonstrate." "Yes, damned clever, that Johnny foreigner, or damned cunning. It's all a matter of perception, one supposes." Dr. Gray had always admired ingenuity when put to diabolical purpose. Mr. Vestervang concurred when shown the mechanism. "On the hilt is a button. Pushed in, the blade is locked." Dr. Gray jabbed against the wooden doorframe of his study, and the blade did not retract. "Push it again, it is unlocked." And then he thrust it once more against his own chest, this time with a small smile. "Did you get that?" He couldn't simply assume his guest's capacity to follow his instructions, so repeated the lesson. Better safe than sorry. "What could be simpler? Here," he said, holding out the knife. "Try it for yourself." Mr. Vestervang jabbed the door frame, the blade disappearing into the haft. "That's a fine parlour trick, I suppose. Almost had a heart attack when you stabbed yourself. No wonder you laughed." Dr. Gray's father left behind little in the way of assets, and even less in practical knowledge, but there was one pearl of wisdom he'd imparted, which came to mind as Mr. Vestervang flashed him a cocky wink, knife held out with both hands, before pulling it back into his body, staggering back in pained shock as the blade enters his chest. "Always remember, there's no task so easy it can't be screwed up, no procedure so basic a step can't be missed, and no instruction so simple a part won't be forgotten." His father had been right. Dr. Gray had neglected to mention that the blade, once retracted, would lock again when released. One had to push the button each time for it to retract. Mea culpa. Now, when an individual, for whatever reason, takes it upon themselves to plunge Damascus steel, with not inconsiderable force, into their own torso, it is reasonable to assume that death will be on them instantly, and for those to whom the terms rotund, stout, or indeed burly could not be implied, this would be the case. Mr. Gray's blade, however, while of sufficient length for the Caucasoid physique of antiquity, was not so for today's all-too-often corpulent Western frame. Mr. Vestervang's blood appeared black on the polished oak floor, but as inconvenient in the throes of death as he had been... as had he been in those of life, he did not fall to the ground as one might have expected. Rather, he flailed about, floundering like some fat, drunken fish. He stumbled backwards through the open doors of the study. Dr. Gray followed, and the rest, well, isn't quite history yet. Typical, wasn't it? Once again, Dr. Gray found himself in an awkward position, to say the least, one where he could come under suspicion even for an act of omission. One could just imagine the scene. "Well, Inspector, Mr. Vestervang swore he'd heard a noise from upstairs." And though I had not, I humoured him and accompanied him to investigate. I was doubtful as to whether this was a sensible course of action, but he was quite insistent. I went one way, he went another, and we found nothing, of course. It is an old house, after all. But next I saw him, he'd emerged from my study bearing the knife, which I immediately recognised as my Syrian piece. Nothing more than a child's toy from a less civilized age, really. At Mr. Vestervang's behest, I explained the mechanism, and demonstrated it upon myself. He then took it from me and did as I had. And at first I thought he was just being immature. He had, as to which his wife can surely attest, an overly theatrical sense of humour. But you can only imagine my horror when I realised the blade had pierced his chest. He staggered back into my study, and I, of course, immediately followed to offer such assistance as I was able, but disastrously my unfortunate clumsiness rendered such aid impossible. I'm afraid I did more harm than good. I, of course, telephoned the emergency services immediately. Now, imagine oneself a policeman, a congenitally suspicious breed, as Dr. Gray had encountered numerous times in the past. Would that story ring true? It assuredly would not convince Inspector Madsen, only giving the man more cause to be the irritant he had proven himself to be. On what grounds was Mr. Vestervang a guest in your home this evening, Doctor? Well, Inspector, I must confess it came as a complete surprise. Mr. Vestervang and I had, of late, what can best be described as a difference of opinion, and our relationship could hardly be described as cordial. So when he came by the house, I was somewhat surprised, but nonetheless invited him in. I believe it important to be polite, to hear a man out, not to mention the open door was allowing the cold air inside. The reason for his visit? Well, that came as more of a surprise than the fact of his presence. He came to confess that, after due consideration, he had concluded that indeed he had been unjustly condemnatory towards me. He even went so far as to admit that his own business and accounting practices had, on occasion, been the progenitor of my ignorant castigation. Naturally, I was gracious, accepting this as the closest thing to an apology that could reasonably be expected, and invited Mr. Vestervang to join me for dinner. I'd been trying out a new recipe, and there was more than sufficient for two. We conversed pleasantly enough, even tentatively, I might add, discussing future business ventures, but then came that blasted noise from upstairs. Dr. Gray mused that even the most obtuse of rural policemen was unlikely to be convinced of the veracity of an account such as this. So what on earth should he do? It would appear disposal and discretion were the only options if he was going to avoid the unpleasantness that would ensue from involving the authorities. No, such an approach was not even to be considered. Unlike Mr. Vestervang, Dr. Gray was wearing simple old clothing. Rags, as his guest had regarded them, and rags indeed, of no nostalgic or monetary value, but certainly of robust manufacture. This was fortunate, as what laid ahead was not the sort of endeavour one embarks on at the risk of one's bespoke tailoring. Dead eyes nonchalantly observed Dr. Gray retrieving his knife. Then, with no small measure of disgust, he stripped his departed guest of garments and accessories as garish and cheap as the man who had worn them. Bodies are never the easiest things to move, but, as luck would have it, he had a new wheelbarrow, in which Mr. Vestervang looked no less dapper in tarpaulin and duct tape than he had in polyester and 9-carat gold. Sat rather snugly. The stairs were quite the palaver, but Dr. Gray managed to manoeuvre the barrow through the house and out into the conservatory, stopping to collect his waiting Remington shotgun and a shovel. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Mr. Vestervang would not have made good company for the roses. So instead Dr. Gray steered him down the gravel path through the grounds leading to the woods. It would have been a shorter and quicker journey to cut across the field, but there'd been heavy rain, and even if he didn't get stuck, he'd doubtless leave a trail that could be followed. Due to a recent state of burglaries in the area, and not trusting safety deposit boxes, Dr. Gray had planned on burying some of the more valuable items in his collection out in these woods. They were on his land after all, so there was no fear of ramblers, campers or hunters coming by. However, being a busy man, all he'd managed to do so far is dig a large hole. Well, fortune smiled again, and after undressing Mr. Vestervang for the second time that evening, an act even Mrs. Vestervang wouldn't be caught in, his guest found his new lodgings to be a comfortable fit. The earth and everything that crawled in it would take care of the organic matter in due course, and wouldn't that be a feast? He felt he was perhaps being overly cautious bringing the shotgun. But what about dental records? No, better safe than sorry. He jumped down into the hole and held the barrel over Mr. Vestervang's face and pulled the trigger. Then, once again, you can't be too careful. The rest of the evening was a simple matter of cleaning up. The floor was washed thoroughly, then all the cloths and towels went into the furnace, along with both men's clothing and the tarpaulin. Now to run a bath. Mr. Vestervang's little vanishing act resulted in the usual gossip, with some in the community acting as if they knew more than they were letting on. Due to his local prominence, it even garnered some official attention, both from the media and, unsurprisingly, the police. Dr. Gray said nothing to the former, and as little as possible to the latter. "I'm sorry, Inspector. Mr. Vestervang and I haven't spoken in some time, and I'm not privy to knowledge concerning his private affairs or state of mind." The missing man's family, friends and associates made the usual protestations of concern, while his wife comported herself with dignity, something one should no longer possess after 15 years of that kind of marriage. Mrs. Vestervang was, as Dr. Gray knew keenly, a woman of discretion. As his father used to say, least said, soonest mended. As for those idle gossipers, why they felt the need to profess the knowledge they could not possibly be privy to was beyond Dr. Gray. He supposed, if he felt the need to be charitable, it brought them a degree of colour and attention, however ill-deserved, into their otherwise dreary, shallow existences. Regarding their assumptions concerning the Vestervang's marriage and his own business affairs, who among us can honestly judge what goes on in the privacy of another's home? The sudden disappearance of someone involved in varied and extensive enterprises can cause difficulties for those left behind. Fortunately, Mrs. Vestervang did not share her husband's suspicions towards Dr. Gray and had, in actual fact, been vocal in his defence. Thus, when asked to assist in dealing with affairs of business, he had been only too delighted to render any assistance he could, and in the subsequent weeks and months a most amicable and trusting relationship grew between the two. Right. Well, that's the end of that one. As a play, I'm sure more work would have been done on it, and of course, yeah, maybe it would have been different. But that is from book 2 of Dave's trilogy. This funny story, as you can see, the spelling is incorrect. This is my proof copy, and I just made a very stupid mistake when I designed the cover. So, but all future, this, as I say, this is one of a kind. This is probably worth millions. But it's also not a pocketbook anymore. It's a larger 5x8 inch, like a normal book size rather than the small one. But it's a good read. Give it a read. And if you've listened this far, God help you. Thanks for listening. I'm going to put links in the description below for Dave's trilogy books, also, other links for stuff. And that's probably it. when I do this, when I do the Audible stuff, if of course I'm not going to be stumbling as much, and you're not going to hear motorcycles travelling past outside. But this is giving you an idea. Maybe I'll do more. Maybe I'll read some from my books as well, because it's quite fun to do the voices, and keeps me out of trouble. Right, good night. Have a good one. Take care. Bye bye. Love you. Ooh.